Okay, good afternoon. Welcome aboard to partially sunny, mostly overcast Binghamton. At least it's not snowing, so that's good news. This is our 2022 Tier Talks. This is something we've had in the works for a while. If you're not familiar, Tier Talks has been around for several years. Tier does actually stand for something, so talks that inspire, educate, and resonate. My name is Dana West. I'm on the board of directors of the Alumni Association. I am the chair of the Lifelong Learning Committee that runs the Tier Talk. So this is our premier event here. When we are getting back into the world, we'll be doing Tier Talks back in the chapters again. So keep an eye out. We love having really engaging talks. This is a killer conversation today. I don't know if you're paying attention, but the midterm elections are around the corner for anybody that hasn't heard yet. So Decision 2022 is our topic for today. We have two really excellent speakers. I'll be handing off for introductions in a moment. But let me just say welcome. We're really looking forward to a great show today. So make sure you get your snacks, get comfortable. And I'm going to hand it off to Steve for introductions. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you, Dana. Thank you, friends, for being here. It's so great to be here for homecoming and to welcome alumni back to campus in person again and doing the things that we love and seeing the people we love. I'm Steve Seepersaud. I work in the Division of Communications and Marketing here at Binghamton University, and I'm proud to be the producer and host of the Tier Talk Speaker Series and very excited to present this program today. And Dana took my line. I was going to say, if you hadn't heard, there's an election coming up in about a month. Turn your TV on or put a YouTube video on and get the barrage of ads before you get to the content that you really want. I think we're all going to be glad in about a month when this is all done. But certainly have a stimulating topic on tap for today and two great speakers. So just a little bit of housekeeping right from the outset. We have two speakers who are going to give a mini tier talk. And after the two tier talks are done, we're happy to take your questions. So start thinking of some great questions, and we'll get those into the mix. You can come up to the floor mic, or Dana will walk around with a handheld mic, and we'll come to you. So just one bit of not so good news. We had advertised three speakers that were going to be as part of the event for today. Dan Magleby from the Department of Political Science was scheduled to be one of our presenters, but had a family emergency come up and unfortunately was not able to join us. But is with us in spirit, and we're hoping to get him as part of an event that we'll do in the future because I think he's really fabulous, and it's great to showcase our faculty as well. We have two great alumni speakers, and so I'm going to keep the introduction short, and they'll talk about in a little bit of detail what they do, and we'll look ahead to this midterm decision 2022. Our first speaker is a member of the class of 1984, has an extensive career in lobbying and public affairs, and comes to us today from Westchester County. His name is Perry Ochacher, and he's the founder and CEO of Willett Public Affairs. So I'll turn it over to Perry. Thanks so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you. And can everyone hear me? Is the microphone on? Thank you. Steve, thank you very much. My name is Perry Ochacher, class of 1984. I was a political science and economics major. When the university first reached out to me today about this, I thought perhaps maybe I'd left something in my dorm room and they were reaching out to tell me they had found it after all these years, but then they had asked me to speak today, and my second thought was, well, maybe they were mixing me up with someone else, but then I realized the odds of there being another Perry Ochacher, who was a political science graduate, were pretty slim, so I realized it was on me. As I said, I was a 1984 graduate, political science, economics of Binghamton University. Back then it was known as SUNY Binghamton. My first class was Poli-Sci 111, Intro to American Government. The reason I'm mentioning that is that was taught by Professor David Cingarinelli, who is still teaching at the university, and I met him yesterday. And we had coffee, and it was really wonderful to be able to come full circle and see him. And we've been in touch over the years. And he really was responsible. I'd always been interested in government and political science. But he really was able to help foster a deep interest in the subject matter. And through my education at Binghamton, research skills, writing skills, but it really all started. It was my first class at SUNY Binghamton was Intro to American Government. So that class is very close to my heart, and it really propelled me, I think, on a career path of being in government and public affairs. So as I had said, I'm president of Willett Public Affairs. It's a New York State-based lobbying and public relations firm. When I was originally asked to speak today, I was going to talk about what does a lobbyist do, what is the role of the lobbyist in the political process, and it then occurred to me that even though that is an interesting topic, and I'm certainly happy to answer questions at the end if people want to know really kind of what does a lobbyist do on a day-to-day basis, I started thinking about it, and I realized really what would happen if we lost our democracy in the United States. Suddenly, lobbying becomes a lot less relevant. What I do becomes almost irrelevant if we no longer have a democracy. And we believe in American exceptionalism. We think we've had a democracy in this country and it can last forever. But I'm not so sure anymore. So that's why I've labeled my speech today, Does American Democracy Stand a Chance? An insider's perspective. I'm the insider. The fundamental question, I believe, as we go into the midterm elections is, will American democracy survive? And the fundamental question I think we should be asking all candidates is, do you believe in American democracy? Do you support and defend the Constitution of the United States of America? That, to me, is the fundamental question as we enter the midterm elections. Democracy does not last forever. This very academic titled slide, Holy Cow, We're Not Democracies Anymore, is an indication of 14 nations that within recent history have lost their democracies. And what's also interesting is they were not lost in a dramatic way. The era of military coups ending democracies and tanks rolling down the streets have somewhat ended. Democracies are lost in a much more subtle way now, and often they are lost through the democratic process, through the electoral process, by a slow whittling away of democratic values. And those lists of 14 nations are examples of countries where, similar to the United States, there was a time when all the citizens of those nations had freedom of expression and freedom of speech, and they were free and fair elections, and they were relatively free and open societies, and they're not anymore. And that's something that those nations have in common with us. They once had it, and they lost it. You might say, well, we're a lot different than those countries, and we are, but the fact is, we have a strong democracy. Is it strong enough? Is it strong enough? The guardrails of American democracy are weakening. And I think we've all been witness to that over the last 5, 10, 15, even 20 years. And that's why I'm worried, and I think that's why everyone here should be worried today. Those guardrails are weakening, and as a result, I've come up with what I feel are 5 symptoms of a weakening democracy in the United States. And the first one is polarization. We are being driven further and further apart through culture wars, ideological polarization, and extremism. 19 years ago, there were 19 states that had one-party control of the state legislature, meaning the governor, both houses of the legislature were controlled by one political party. 19 states. Today, we're almost at 40. It's almost doubled. You might say, oh, why is that a bad thing? One-party control, you get things done easier. Well, no. One-party control leads to more political extremism. States where you have a division of power between, say, the executive and the legislature lead more toward compromise. When you have an increasing number of state legislatures controlled by one political party, you tend to get more extremism. You tend to get partisan lawmaking. You tend to get an appeal to the extreme sides of the political spectrum. And issues such as abortion, guns, immigration, voting and election administration are the issues that are being debated in the states that are driving that polarization. And the states are dividing, as you know, along political lines. That is increasing. Polarization, that's the first symptom that there is something wrong in our democracy. Polarization is increasing. And what does that polarization lead to? It leads to separation, literal separation, not just figurative separation. It started in the 2000 presidential election. That's when we first started talking about red and blue states, because with the Gore-Bush presidential campaign, they would show the map and the red states and how were they breaking in the blue states. So that's when we first started thinking about red and blue, when we really started thinking in a divided manner. And that proliferation, that extremism really started exacerbating and accelerating at that point. And the polarization continued and started really, I think, accelerating. And even though it was symbolic, I think just the notion of calling certain states red and blue states just made a visualization of the division that's increasing in this country. And so what's happened since 2000? We're further divided. We're divided by race. We're divided by religion, geography, and culture. Politics has become personal. It is a form of personal identity, where if you insult someone's political beliefs, you're now insulting them as a person. It's a personal affront. It didn't used to be that way. I remember two examples. One, I was reading Ted Kennedy's autobiography, and he was talking about once he was on the Senate floor and he was debating Bob Dole, really going at each other, hard, on the Senate floor, tearing into each other. And when the debate was over, as Senator Kennedy was walking by Senator Dole's desk, he winked at him, and Bob Dole winked back. And that's what partisanship looked like in the United States Senate back in the 1970s and the 1980s. You could be political opponents, but you still maintain that personal friendship. You went out to dinner. That's almost non-existent in Washington now. It was common at the end of the day. Republicans, Democrats, people socialized together. Now, almost unheard of. Another thing that I remember, I once had the privilege of meeting former Senator Fred Thompson, and I asked him that same question. I said, this was after he had left the Senate. As many of you know, he had run for president. I asked him, what do you miss most about Washington? And the one thing he said was the civility and the camaraderie, which is lost. The other thing he said to me, which I thought was very funny, I said, what career, because as many of you know, he also went on to become a TV star, a movie star. And I said, what career did you enjoy more, politics or being a movie star? And he said, well, of course, there's more money in politics. So I thought that was a great line. And I'm sure he's been asked that question before. So what's the result of all this separation? There's greater intolerance. There's greater hostility between people of varying political opinions. That is increasing. Another symptom, disturbing symptom that I think we're all seeing, demonization. Political leaders now, and this is not an ideological conversation. The criticisms I'm laying out today apply to both parties. There's apocalyptic warnings and divisive tactics. Political opponents are portrayed as mortal enemies, and we appeal to populism, nativism, and demagoguery to move votes. Another sign of a weakening democracy. And one of the things that I personally can't stand is the hateful, divisive political speech that we hear coming out of the mouths of our national elected leaders. I'll just quote some of them because you've heard them. Enemy of the state, sick, sinister people, threat to the foundation of our republic, lock her up. These are all phrases that have been uttered by national leaders, and not just one. I didn't just single one out here. These are both parties that have uttered these words. That would have been unimaginable in this country several years ago, and now it's par for the course. That is not a good sign. Exploitation, another symptom. The first is the most obvious. We see public officials using their office for private gain. That is exhibit one of Banana Republic. And we've seen that, and we continue to see that. But perhaps more troubling and more pernicious is using institutional prerogatives in an unrestrained way. So what do I mean by that? Both parties are guilty of exploiting the political system for partisan gain. What do I mean? Ideas of packing the court, unilateral executive orders that undermine the legislative process, issuing presidential pardons to bail out political allies, overuse of the filibuster. The filibuster was once extremely rare. It's something that can completely shut down the legislative process. It was used judiciously. Now it's used commonly. From 2017 to 2012, it was used 385 times to basically shut down debate. The total number of times in the prior 80 years that it was used was 80. So 80 times there was a filibuster between 1910 and 1990. Between 2007 and 2012, filibuster 385 times. Advice and consent, obstructing appointments. Now you might say, well, these are all the powers that either the president has, that the legislature has, and it's true. They have these powers. They technically have the ability to use them, but they are being exploited now and weaponized. They used to be used rarely in the past because political leaders knew that these were extreme political tools that should be used only under the most extreme circumstances, filibustering a bill only when there was a tremendous, pressing need to slow down debate on a topic. Now it's become commonplace. Impeachment is another prime example. Between 1860 and President Nixon, who wasn't impeached but was heading toward impeachment once. Impeachment once. And in the last 20 years, impeachment frequent times. Again, the reason I label it as exploitation, it's exploitation because, yes, the Congress has the power to impeach. That's not what we're questioning. We're questioning exploiting it for partisan gain, weaponizing impeachment. And the reason impeachment was rarely used in that 100-year period was because there was an agreement between both parties that we only impeach when there is bipartisan support, when there's an agreement, both sides of the aisle, that this president, or it could be any other high federal official, has committed, quote-unquote, high crimes and misdemeanors. When the Congress decided to proceed with impeachment proceedings against President Nixon, they had bipartisan support. It wasn't a one-party decision. Both parties agreed this man must go. He is violating democratic norms. That has ended. We've exploited the impeachment process for political purposes. Again, you see that in countries that are either not democracies or losing their democracies. They exploit what can be done for political purposes. And finally, one of the other symptoms that I see is satirization and distraction. Everything's become a joke. You put on Saturday Night Live, they're parroting the president, they're parroting the Congress. It's funny, I laugh, it's funny, but it makes everything a big joke. And on top of all the other problems we have, when things are so serious, and we should be taking things so seriously, things become a joke. And the message we're sending to the people watching, particularly young people, is it is a joke. Politics is a joke. And we should be taking it as seriously as we can be right now. And the message we're sending through media is, in too many instances, is that it's a joke. And on top of that, the distraction of technology and entertainment, the decline of local political reporting, and the rise of partisan media, and not being able to determine anymore what the truth is when you're turning on your television, it really reminds me the 1976 film Network, Paddy Chayefsky, the scene of Howard Beale when he's ranting on television. It is one of the most prescient scenes on a commentary on politics and media. If you haven't seen the film, first of all, it's a great film to watch. It's a lot of fun. But that film, uncanny in its prediction of the future and what would happen to media and politics in the United States. Just watch that one scene. Howard Beale said, most people just want to be left alone in their living rooms with their televisions and their toaster ovens and their radial tires. They didn't want to look for trouble. They just want to be left alone. Well, the message that I have for you today is trouble is coming, and trouble will find you, even if you do not want to look for trouble. And that is unfortunately where we're heading, and that's where I think these symptoms are leading us. So what is the culmination of all of these symptoms and all of these problems that we're beginning to witness in our democracy? In a fantastic book, How Democracies Die, Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt, two Harvard University political scientists. And by the way, I have the book right here. It's a short book. You should read it. It's really fabulous in terms of describing the problem. They list 4 factors that are indications of authoritarian political behavior: rejection of or weak commitment to democratic rules of the game, denial of the legitimacy of political opponents, toleration or encouragement of violence, readiness to curtail civil liberties of opponents, including media. And we don't have time to go into a discussion of each one of these. In their book, they have a chapter dedicated to each one. But suffice it to say, we are ticking off every single one of those boxes. And again, that is not an ideological commentary. That applies to both political parties. We are hitting every single one of those boxes. And what do we have in common with other nations who've lost their democracies? They hit all those boxes too. So ultimately, as a result of that, what's the consequence? We've lost 2 things, or we're losing 2 things. Let's hope we don't lose them. We're losing mutual toleration and institutional forbearance. Those are two concepts that kept this country together. They were the glue that were not described in the Constitution, because you can't write that into a Constitution. The Constitution is the rules by which we live. But those two concepts were more of an agreement that was part of the political culture, and we're potentially sacrificing them now. And I just want to describe them briefly because of how important they are. By mutual toleration, I mean not looking at your opponent as an existential threat. The Bob Dole, Ted Kennedy example that I had said. At the end of the day, you're political opponents, then you slap each other on the back, you go out for dinner. It's not personal. You can come together on the next issue. You could do something for the good of the country. You don't become mortal enemies. It's not a concept of winning at all costs. It's politics. It's your profession. It's not your identity. The other side is not the enemy. They're not out to destroy your way of life. And by using mutual toleration, you can move toward compromise. You could create policy. You're not looking at the other side as an enemy to be vanquished. Institutional forbearance refers to self-control, restraint, and tolerance. Without it, checks and balances becomes deadlock and dysfunction. That's what I was referring to before. Institutional forbearance. You have the power of impeachment, but you don't do it. You could block appointments to the Supreme Court, but you don't do it because you recognize that government has to function, and you're not going to do it just to be able to punish the other side, because a functioning democracy needs people appointed to office. And there have been both sides of the political spectrum who've approached the appointment process and said, well, we're shutting it down now. As long as we're here, that president doesn't get one appointment. That is a prime example of institutional forbearance that is being dissolved. The disappearance of forbearance and mutual toleration is really probably the leading cause of the death of democracies in the world. And as a result of that, I think we've defined political deviancy down in this country. And what I mean by that, and that comes from former Senator Moynihan, who wrote a really incisive work on social sciences about how unacceptable behavior, if it's repeated, and if it becomes so part of the common parlance and culture, it becomes acceptable. So suddenly something that once would have seemed so deviant and terrible in language and inappropriate, it just becomes part of the normal. And that's also where we are right now. I think because of all of the symptoms we've seen in our democracy and the slow diminishment of the political culture, we have divined our political deviancy downward. And we've accepted things that we shouldn't accept. And the sad result of that is the United States is no longer the democratic model for the world. Who ever thought we would say that? Who ever thought we would say that? New York Times the other day, front page. Use of civil war soars after Mar-a-Lago search. Did that scare the hell out of you? On the front page of the New York Times, we're talking about civil war. Whether it happens or not, and I still think the possibility of that actually happening is pretty slim, but on the front page of the New York Times, to see that there could even be a discussion, mention of the term civil war in the context of this country is a shame, and it's an example of our political deviancy having been adjusted downward. So what could we do to prevent this, or reverse it, or stem the tide? First question is, will lobbyists save us? The answer is no. I just want to get that out of the way very quick. I'm a lobbyist. If you're wondering, will lobbyists save our democracy? The answer is no. So we can move on to that slide, past that slide very quick. There are certain steps that I think we can take to arrest the decline. Some that come to mind. First, Congress needs to step up and do its job. Congress needs to tackle some of these issues, whether it's abortion or immigration, guns, that are dividing the states. The Congress is the appropriate regulatory body, legislative body to deal with these issues. They've abrogated those responsibilities, and as a result, I think we're suffering for it. So if Congress were to step up, I think that would potentially help the situation. I think the political parties could be reformed. The political parties in this country used to act as gatekeepers. And what you may think of one political party or another, the fact is they acted as gatekeepers, and in that function they weeded out inappropriate people from running for office. And what's the result of the fact that the parties have become so weak now, and we don't have time to discuss why, but the fact is they are. They no longer have the control over the political process they did. What's the result of that? You have a political primary where you've got 16 people running, one of whom their only qualification running for president is they wrote a best-selling book. And I'm not downplaying the accomplishment of writing a book, but I don't think that is the appropriate sole qualification to be running for the most important job in the world. Again, that would have been unthinkable at a certain time in the United States because the political parties would have acted as gatekeepers. And that person, however nice and intelligent they may be, they never would have gotten the opportunity to pursue that position at that time because the parties acted as mechanisms where they screened out inappropriate individuals who at times were demagogues. Henry Ford, Joseph McCarthy. These were people who had presidential ambitions. Huey Long, but they were also demagogues. And the parties at the time acted as gatekeepers and said, you are not an appropriate person to be running the United States. You do not represent American ideals of democracy and individual freedom and egalitarianism. That is gone. Now, if you've got a pretty face or you've got money or if you've got media access, you are a potential presidential candidate. You go into a state, you have an operation, you start your ballot access work, and you could be a viable presidential candidate. And I think if we had stronger parties, we would see a very different quality of elected official from the president all the way down. The parties no longer perform this crucial function. We could also do a constitutional convention and try and make changes to the Constitution. That, for reasons we can't get into, very difficult to amend the Constitution. It's an unlikely reform. Bipartisan redistricting commissions to end gerrymandering and improper redistricting, and I know Nicole is going to mention that. Ranked choice voting. Again, we don't have time to get into all of these things, but these are ways we could potentially reform the system we have to make it where voting, the elected officials and folks running for office are appealing more to the middle and not to the extremes. The problem, and Nicole will go into it, with current redistricting, gerrymandering, a term you've heard, it appeals to the political extremes. They are the ones who show up at the primaries. So they're attracting candidates who are extremist candidates on both sides of the political spectrum. So if we had reform of the voting procedures through ranked choice, et cetera, multi-member districts, that could help. However, that will take time. Sometimes I feel like that's just really rearranging deck chairs in the Titanic as the ship is slowly sinking. So what can we do that would be of more immediate effect is, I think, putting together coalitions of like-minded Americans who believe in democracy and supporting candidates, regardless of political party, who support American democracy, who support the Constitution of the United States. And the other article from the Times I had was, this was just an op-ed the other day, a plan B for responsive Americans living in red states. And this is a beautiful article about Montana, how leading Republican and Democrat in the state, political opponents, they agree on no issues really. They came together to endorse an independent candidate running against a Republican because they believe the Republican is a threat to American democracy. They put their political differences aside to make that endorsement. That is probably the one really immediate effective thing I think we can do. And as we enter the midterm elections, that is the question. That is the essential question we need to be asking candidates. It doesn't matter if you're pro-choice or pro-life or where you are on immigration. You have to put those political questions aside and ask the candidate, do you believe in American democracy? Do you support and defend the United States Constitution? If the answer is no, it shouldn't really matter where they are on the issues, because ultimately you're going to lose the country that you love and that you believe in. But if they believe in the process, there'll be a mechanism where we could work this out. That's what democracy is all about. And we'll work out the issues such as abortion and immigration, guns. We'll work them out because we have a system that allows us to do that if we give it a chance. But people are giving up on that system. We have to support candidates, regardless of political party, that believe in the American creed of individual freedom and egalitarianism. And we need to bring together groups with dissimilar or even opposing political views to stand up for American democracy. And we need to do it in a nonviolent way. We can protest, but violent protest does two things. One, it further results in repression of whatever political party or administration is in power, because now they have an excuse to crack down on the other party because they're violent, and you lose the middle. You have violent protest, you lose the middle ground of Americans. And we need to temporarily, as I said, overlook political disagreements to find common moral ground. I'm just going to close with a quote. This was Lyndon Johnson, it's Governor George Wallace in 1965, and George Wallace was in the White House, as you know, governor of Alabama, leading segregationist bigot. Changed his views at the end of his life, whether he was thinking about his legacy or not, I don't know, but he did choose a different path. Maybe this quote had something to do with it, because he had met the president, and he was talking about what was happening in Alabama and trying to get a handle on all the protests. And he was no friend to the civil rights movement. So President Johnson said to Governor Wallace, George, you and I shouldn't be thinking about 1968. We should be thinking about 1988. We'll both be dead and gone then. What do you want left behind? Do you want a great big marble monument that says George Wallace, he built? Or do you want a little piece of scrawny pine lying there that says George Wallace, he hated? George Wallace later admitted that is one of the most significant, moving things anyone had ever said to him. Even though it didn't change his immediate political views, it started to change how he was thinking. Because what Lyndon Johnson was really saying to him that day was that the politics of destruction will destroy you, but the politics of love and creation will save you. And I think by extension, that is the question we have to ask ourselves. And the choice we must make is, will hate destroy our society, or will love save it? And I think some people feel that's a simplistic notion, but I really believe that this is what it comes down to. Everything will grow from there. If we believe that we can love our political opponents, not vilify them, work with them, understand them, even if we don't agree with them, exhibit compassion and understanding as opposed to hatred, misunderstanding, which is much easier to do, so much easier to hate than it is to take the time to understand somebody that doesn't agree with you. That will save our society. I think that is the hope of our democracy. We need to support candidates who stand up for that. And we need to hear our national leaders delivering that message. Why aren't more national leaders standing up and saying that very thing? I believe in love, compassion, understanding. I support candidates of either party who believe in those principles and principles of American democracy. Getting back to the midterm election again, I think that's the fundamental question. And I think it's the path that we all must determine, which we will all choose, the path of love or the path of hate. And I choose the path of love, and I hope you do too. Thank you.
Perry, thank you so much for that presentation. And it's interesting to look at both sides of it. One is grim in thinking about that a system that we've sort of taken for granted that it would live on forever is fading away from us and could disappear. And we could be on that list of countries that was on one of the earlier slides of the presentation. And the other side being that the story isn't over, and it doesn't have to go this way. And as we turn the page to go into the next mini-tier talk, it'll expand more on the sense of voter activism and taking a stand and trying to get people to participate so we can take this thing back. It just needs a major wake-up call to get people involved, and I think our next speaker is the person just to do that. So I'm pleased to introduce Nicole Yearwood, who comes to us from New York City. She is a two-time graduate of Binghamton University, earned her undergraduate degree in 1997, and then stayed to earn her Master of Public Administration in 1998. And I see Harper College gear in the crowd and Binghamton University, and regardless of when you're here, this has always been a very politically, socially conscious place. And that's not going to change, and I think that's certainly one of the hallmarks of Binghamton University, as Nicole will tell us, the roots of her activism and what she does now were very much rooted in her time here as a student. So please introduce Nicole. Thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Well, while I introduce myself, so thank you all for coming this morning. Once again, my name is Nicole Yearwood. I'm a two-time graduate of, I like to say, SUNY Binghamton, because I was just on that cusp of the transfer from SUNY Binghamton to Binghamton University, and some of us did resist that for a time, but yes, I did get my roots of activism actually at Binghamton University. So this is really a full circle moment for me to come back here and speak about the subject of the midterm elections. And just a little bit on why I started and how I got started. So when I was probably freshman going into sophomore year, the governor at the time was putting in cuts to the tuition assistance program. And I actually came to Binghamton through the Educational Opportunity Program and received TAP. I was a TAP recipient. And so what I realized is that this elected official, this governor person, can do something that's going to affect me personally, directly, and my ability to stay on this campus and get my education. And so with that, I switched from computer science. Well, later on, I decided to switch from computer science. I was interested in going into the Watson School. And I said, I want to get into government. I want to help people understand how government works. And from that point forward, that's why I got my master's in public administration. And I'm also a senior manager for government relations for a global micromobility company. So as well, and then I do Educated Voter. Educated Voter started because I realized that people like me didn't understand how this process actually worked. And so I'm sure a lot of you who are here, you're interested in the subject, you get it, you get why it works, but I'm sure you know some people who are well educated. They don't have an understanding of how our government functions. So even just the title, we're talking about the midterm elections, right? And so I kind of don't like that kind of thing. I don't like this whole, the presidential and the midterms. Why? Because it has us programmed as US citizens to vote at inflection points, right? Voting should be something we do all the time. Eat, work, pay bills, vote. Take the kids to school, take them to soccer practice, vote. Go to preschool, go to college, go to elementary, go to high school, you vote. We should be voting all the time. It should be something that is ingrained into us, and unfortunately, that's not the case. You know, what I love to say, and Perry outlined the status of our country in a fantastic way. But I like to talk about we the people, right? We the people of these United States, right? Y'all know where that comes from, right? We the people. We have a role in this thing. And too many of us are not stepping up to the plate and playing our role in this democracy that we have. So I like to say, and you'll find this, you know, on my social and other posts, civic engagement does not begin or end on election day. Voting is not it. When I talked about that tuition assistance program and the governor cutting those funds, a sophomore, I got on a bus with NYPIRG. Y'all remember NYPIRG, right? So NYPIRG, very active. NYPIRG hosted a bus, and I think we had 2 buses, and we rode up to Albany, and I sit on those steps, and if you go to the Educational Opportunity Office now, the picture is up of me pumping my fists, and we're on the steps. And we're advocating, and we're talking, and some people went and they spoke to their state assembly members, and they spoke to their state senators to advocate for the tuition assistance program. Advocacy is important. Too many of us are thinking, you know what, I voted and I'm done. I'm going back to my corner, going back to live. I don't have anything else to do. But you must advocate for the things you want. Elected officials, they don't know it all and they don't get it right all the time. And that's when they need to hear from who? We the people. So, we got representatives. I'm from New York City, so this is going to be, there may be some differences here and there. But how many people realize that there are 16 people out in the world, in the United States, talking about they represent you? 16. Do y'all know that? 16 people are representing you right now, based on where you live. 16. Now, we talk about voting, and so these are the 16 people who represent me. Not exactly the 16, because with the legislative bodies, I just threw the pictures of the leader of the legislative bodies in there. But these are the folks out here in the street talking about they represent me. Now, think about it. If you only vote for president, you say, oh, I voted for Joe Biden. Or I voted for Donald Trump. I went and I voted, and I'm done. That's 1 out of 16. And Perry also touched on that whole working together part, right? If you only voted for one, and you didn't vote for the people that they have to work with to get policy and get laws passed, are you filling in the rest of the gaps? There's pieces of the puzzle that are missing. If you only vote in the midterms, right? The midterm focus, and again, why I don't like these inflection points. Oh, vote in the presidential. You'd have missed all the people, the rest of the folks on the ballot. So the last time we had the president on the ballot in 2020, and I tell people, if you're from New York City and the last time you voted was a presidential election, you could have possibly missed 5 elections already. Already, 5. And in certain districts, because we're not even going to get into special elections, where everyone can vote, 5. I'm a primary voter, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit down the road. I vote in primaries, the general, the special, I vote all the time. But if the last time you voted was November 2020, Houston, we've got a problem. Okay? You done already missed some stuff. But 16 people. And I might pop quiz some folks how many people can name all of their elected representatives. And I didn't even put the judges on here. People know we can elect our judges too. And you might be electing some sheriffs, depending on where you're from. You might elect your school board also. So this is not even everybody. This is kind of sort of most people. But this ain't everybody you can elect. Then, again, when we talk about working together, we got the 3 levels, which I had on the last slide, and then we have the 3 branches. Again, you just vote for the president. That's the executive branch. And that's nice and all. But he can't do everything, and she can't do everything all by themselves. They have to come and they have to work together, because we have this funky thing called separation of powers and checks and balances. So you have your president who can do some things. Then you have your House of Representatives and your state and your Senate together. They're the legislative body. On the state level, we have the state assembly and the state senate. They're the legislative body. They have to work with the governor. And speaking of the midterms, our governor's on the ballot. Let me just pop back to this page. Our governor's on the ballot. Our comptroller's on the ballot. Our attorney general also on the ballot. But when we say midterms, we only think of House of Representatives. But there's so many other things on those ballots when we talk about these inflection points. But I want to pop back over here. Again, when we're only voting for our member of the House during the midterm or our president, all the functions that the legislative body does, we haven't even picked those people. And then we're surprised when things aren't going the way we want, when we're only voting for maybe one person or maybe 2 people, when we have folks that they have to work together to accomplish anything. That's just how our founding fathers did it. They said we didn't want any one person or any one branch to have all the power. So we have all these representatives, and they have to work together to get things done. So this is why voting in every election all the time, this should be a regular way of life. It shouldn't be just every 2 years, every 4 years. I counted back. I've been voting since 2016. I voted every year since 2016. It's now 2022, and I think I voted in 2015, but I just stopped counting backwards. But I said I voted then, and I voted then, and we had to vote then, and we had to vote then. So we need to be voting every year. And that's why, again, that's why I'm kind of anti these older midterms. Now I talked about those 16 people who represent us. They represent us by virtue of where we live. But how does that happen? Through the redistricting process. And if anybody's been paying attention to the New York State redistricting process, has it kind of gone the way we expected? New York State now has an independent redistricting commission, but all of our lines kind of sort of got drawn by a special master. We still don't have assembly district lines. Again, we don't have enough time to get into those details. But the redistricting process is the process by which every 10 years, our political district lines, and namely our legislative districts, because they're not redrawing county district lines, but they are going to redraw our House of Representatives. So our members of the House, those 435 districts across the country, in the process of being redrawn, some at different stages. Then we'll draw our state assembly district lines, our state senate district lines, and in New York City, they just voted up our city council district lines. That commission passed the district lines. They now be with the city council. And so all of our legislative district lines are redrawn. And this process is based on the census. And again, I'm going to get into we the people, because they said, well, how can we get involved? Like all these activities seem like they're just happening outside of us. You can get in on that redistricting process by simply completing your census. It's done based on population every 10 years. So I actually worked on the census for 3 years before I started with this micromobility company, just for the redistricting process. Because I know this is how our 435 House district lines are going to be redrawn, our state legislative district lines and city council district lines. And as somebody who pushes voting, I said, you know what? This census thing is kind of a way for us to start from scratch. Making sure people complete the census, we can get new district lines, maybe get different elected officials, because the census is all about counting the entire population. And this is Article 1, Section 2 of the U.S. Constitution that states that we have to do this every 10 years. So even in the pandemic, we had to go out and make sure everyone was counted. So I just want to be clear about that. Constitutional mandate. So you count everybody, and then it's about people saying, you know what, we do things together, right? As a community, maybe the people over here, you all shop at that same supermarket. Maybe you all worship at the same church or the same synagogue. You come together and do different things. Maybe there's a cultural institution that keeps your community together. You say, listen, you can't move us from here. We come at this cultural institution, for example, in Harlem, where I'm from, the Schomburg Center. Schomburg Center. We came together and said, you can't have Harlem without the Schomburg Center. You can't have Harlem without Harlem Hospital. And so those are the kinds of things we say, keeping communities of interest together. Now, we touched on gerrymandering. And so this kind of gets to why we had a special master come and say, since you all can't get your lines together yourselves, we got to send somebody in to do it. Gerrymandering is when districts are drawn to favor one entity over the other. And mostly in our case, it's one political party over the other. So they kind of said, you all gerrymandered, not nice, we got to go back to the drawing board. So that's what happened with this is the short story of what happened with our redistricting process in New York State. Now, in New York State, this is district representation. So I'm putting these numbers up because I want to get back to talking about the voting piece and our civic participation in that we the people thing. A city council district represents roughly 172,000 people based on the 2020 census. State assembly districts, about 134,000 people, again, based on the 2020 census. A state senate district, about 320,000 people. Again, this is based on census data. This is all numbers. I tell people all the time, sometimes it's just a numbers game. House of Representatives, 776,000 people, in every congressional district across this country, again, based on the census data. This is all numbers, this is all data. You can look this up. Now, let's talk about voter turnout. Now, I'm not saying everybody in these districts can come out and vote, because we got a thing also called voting age population. And so you'll see that, you'll look maybe in the 172,000, 150,000 are voting age population. But I want to pop over here. I want to talk about voter turnout. And again, I want to go back to we the people, our role in how our government works. I argue with some people, we're not doing our job. We complain about our government, we complain about politics and the situation, but are we participating? Are we putting those 16 people in office who know how to behave nicely and work together? I don't know if we the people are doing what we're supposed to do. And you see some clips here I put together. New York City voter turnout hits record low for mayoral election. The lowest. This was last year, 2021. Remember I talked about if you didn't vote since 2020, you missed some things? Our whole citywide government was up in New York City. Lowest voter turnout in 7 decades to elect the New York City government. We're supposed to be the greatest city in the world. Lowest voter turnout in 7 decades. 20% turnout in New York primaries. That's from September of 2013. New York City had an abysmal low voter turnout. That's from 2017. Notice, these are all not presidential years, by the way, 2013, 2017, 2021. Again, why you need to vote in those odd years as well as the even years. Voter turnout is low. So now we're electing, a very small we, under 20% we, are the ones who are deciding who represents us, the big we, in government. So we got 20% of 172,000, 20% of 134,000, 20% of 320,000, 20%, 776,000. And I didn't even bring the information from the primary election, because we have primaries, but I'm going to talk about that in a minute. Low voter turnout, but every vote still counts. Some people say, it was raining, I ain't going to vote. I didn't make it. They say, Nikki, I didn't make it, it was raining. Nikki, I was tired, you know, I had a long day at work. I just couldn't get to the polls. I just couldn't do it. Now we have early voting, right? So I'm fighting people on those excuses, but now we have early voting in New York State. Some states had it ahead of us. We're a little late with the early voting piece. And some changes to absentee voting, and then pandemic-related changes to voting that allowed a little more access than we had in New York State. But every vote counts. These are people winning elections by one vote. One man in Alabama, he messed around, took a trip, and got home too late because of the plane delay, didn't vote for himself, lost the election by 1 vote. That's what happened here in Alabama. Small town, small office he's running for. His wife voted, they went on the trip. He said, oh, make sure I don't lose by 1 vote because you didn't vote. And he lost because he didn't vote. Got home late, the vote was tied. They had to draw straws or roll dice or something. This woman, Boston City Council race, and these are recent elections. This is not 1800s losing by a vote. This is 2018. This, I believe, was in I think this was 2019, and this was 2017, 2018. 1 vote. Now in Virginia, I don't know if some of you are from Virginia or know what's going on live down there now. This 1 vote in the first one, the Daily Press, not only determined the winner of that election, but determined the balance of power in the state government. 1 vote. 1. These are all 1, and there's more 1 vote stories. I said I want to pull up a couple, but there are more 1 vote stories. So while you're thinking that big sea of we the people, your vote doesn't matter, it actually does. And if you want to get the government that you want to see, the type of people you want to see in office, give them a shot. What I like to talk about, and I want to go back here to these numbers, the fraction of people who were showing up. Now, if only 20% voted, that means that 80% did not. And in that 80%, imagine if those 80% folks came out and said, I'm going to go give that underdog a chance. We all know some underdog candidates. We seen them get out there and they said they'd be really good, but they probably don't have a chance because we know the political scheme, the clubs and how it works. It's hard for an underdog candidate. Incumbency is hard to defeat. But if you think about the fact that only 20% are turning out, if that underdog could get 20% of the 80%, they might be able to win. They might have a shot if we just showed up for them, right? So I want you to go back. I want to make sure you talk to folks, because this is in a state, right? So I'm talking about New York City because this is where I'm from, I'm very familiar. Statewide, if you look at our voter turnout, New York State, out of the 50 states, we're in the 40s. The Empire State, we're supposed to be great at everything, not voting. We're in the 40s. Not filling out the census either, though we did. We did manage to not lose 2 congressional seats. Every census since 1940, we were losing more than 2 congressional seats. This time we only lost 1. So we did do our census a little bit better than the last time, but we got some work to do, right? Our voter turnout is low for a state. And then let's talk about as a country, we have the lowest voter turnout as a developed nation, one of the lowest. So we the people of these United States aren't doing our job. And I know we're running on time. So I just kind of threw this democracy chart together. I was sitting around and I said, it's a lot of work keeping this all together if you're not entrenched in it like I am. But you see, I have the years ending 0 through 9. Oversight, and again, this is the interconnectedness of our elected officials and how they're supposed to play nice together in the sandbox, the separation of powers, the checks and balances, all of that, city, state, federal. And then we have our, besides city, state, and federal, then we have our executive, legislative, and judicial, how they're all supposed to work together. Offices up for election. Again, I just started in the year ending in 0. And I just thought off the top of my head, so I might have missed a couple. But 0, 1, 2, next year in New York City, we're gonna have to vote for city council members again because of redistricting. Then we're gonna have the year ending in 4. We know that's presidential, so you'll hear all the hoopla and the hubbub. But then 5, for us in New York City, we're gonna have to vote again for our citywide elected officials because they only have 4-year terms. Those 16 people don't have to be there forever. Some have 2-year terms, 4-year terms, 6-year terms. Like our senators, they have 6-year terms, but our House, they only have 2-year terms. Our state legislature, 2-year terms. Council members, 4-year terms. Citywides, 4-year terms. So you should always you should be voting on these cycles. And of course, we couldn't have the whole government go out at once. That's why I staggered. So again, it's always something for us to vote on. And I know it might be something in the year ending in 9. I just haven't gotten that far down yet because sometimes they don't put that information out. But I'm counting based on terms, and I'm like 1, 2, 3, 4. But all this, you should be voting regularly every year. It just should be something we do. Not just midterm, not just presidential, but every year. And God forbid there's a special election. But the good thing about special elections is that everybody gets to play. Should I join a party? Should you get in a party? I don't know. But I know that when I was starting out in government, I was one of those people, I don't want to be a Democrat, I don't want to be a Republican. And so they elbowed me. They was like, girl, you can't vote in the primary unless you're in the party. So now wherever you're from, if you're not from New York, think about it. Does my state have, are we a closed primary state? Because that's going to help you make a determination. If you can go and vote in the primary without being a member of the party, then hey, you might not need to join one. But I know for those of us who are in New York City or in a place where there's a closed primary system, and that there's one particular party that has that overwhelming majority where basically during the primary the decision is made, right? There's no contest during the general. you might want to join that party so you could at least pick that person who's then going to the general election. Just something to give a thought, no pressure, but just something to think about so that you can participate in the process. Civic engagement does not begin or end on election day. It doesn't begin and end with voting. We can advocate, and I talked about my advocacy while I was here at Binghamton. You can also give policy ideas. You can determine, you can shape your government. Your elected officials, sometimes they need your back. So you can advocate, you can call their office, you can talk to them. All the information is on the web now. And I like to say, because something Perry said is very important, we can engage and disagree in a civil way. Elected officials are people too. We wonder why we don't get the kind of candidates we want. It's because, let me tell you, nobody wants to deal with being beat up on and being a punching bag. So I say, listen, you can approach your elected official, but remember they're a person. I'm one of those people where if they are eating, I might give them a few minutes to finish their food before I say hello if I have a policy question, right? They also sign up for their newsletter. Follow them on social media to keep up with what's going on. If you have an issue you're concerned about, go to the town hall. Let them know they can't read your mind. They can't think of everything. Offer the suggestion. And then also, I challenge people to actually work with them to get something done. You want to see something different in your community? Go suggest the idea and say, you know what, I'll work with you. I have this idea. Can I partner with you? Can we work together to get this done? Is this something we can achieve together? Let's not just say, oh, you need to do this and then run away. And I find that that's what a lot of us are doing. And so again, I'm gonna end where I started with the we the people. We have a role in our democracy. Are we playing our part? Are you all playing your part? Are you talking to your friends and neighbors? Are you playing that role in your democracy, the we the people part, to make sure that we're going in a direction that you would like to see? So with that, just my general contact information. And I know we're running on time, so I'm gonna just wrap up there, and I guess we'll take questions. Thank you.
Nicole, thank you so much for a great presentation. And if that doesn't inspire someone to vote, I don't know what will. And the next time I hear somebody say, I'm tired, I don't want to go vote, or it was a long day, or it's raining, I'm going to have you call them and give them a thing or two about getting out to vote. And it's like a lot of other things in life where you get out what you put into it. If you don't vote and you don't like the process and don't like the result, look in the mirror and see that you're part of the problem, and we want to get people to be part of the solution. So, as in the typical Tier Talks tradition, we're into overtime. I know we've got lunch right after this, so if you need to scoot, that's totally fine. We'll hang around and take your questions. This gentleman right here is very eager to ask questions, so we'll take it.
Nicole, everything you're saying is fine. J.D. Reagan, Laborers Union, Local 942, Fairbanks, Alaska. Everything you're saying is fine, but most people are working too hard, just trying to survive to do all this. I talked with my foreman, and I said, what are you doing voting Republican? And I said, Republicans are just trying to get rid of Davis-Bacon. Where would we be without Davis-Bacon? I said, Democrats are trying to raise minimum wage, and the Republicans are struggling. He said, J.D., I don't know these things. And he doesn't have time because he's working 7/12s, trying to get a road built, and he's missing his son's first football game. He doesn't, and his wife is calling saying, why aren't you here at the football game? And he's trying to get this road built. And most people do not have the time to do this. He doesn't have time to go online and figure all this stuff out.
So that's a great question. So there are entities like TurboVote. And I talked about signing up for the newsletter so that he can keep up with what his elected officials are doing. This information can now come directly to your cell phone, to your email. I even get text messages reminding me to vote. If you sign up for TurboVote, I think it's turbovote.org. Again, those reminders and information, the voting information will come directly to you. Signing up and just getting those notifications so that now we don't have to go out as much and get the information, because listen, we all have cell phones, we have the watches, we may have emails, computers, etc. With all this technology, the information can come to us. You said that he's focused and concerned about making ends meet. You mentioned some of the issues, how the government is trying to raise the minimum wage.
He's no Trump.
Right, and so it's reminding people of those kind of things, that if you're concerned about making ends meet, this is the role government plays in your ability to make ends meet. When you talk about, you said he had a child, things like completing the census. This is how programs, our school lunch program, Title I funds to schools, even student loans. There are several educational programs that are funded to our local municipalities strictly based on census data. Head Start programs as well. Funding for schools, after school programs, some of them are funded based on census data. So when we talk about it's understanding the role that these democratic processes have on the daily impact and the things that people care about. So what I try to do in general is approach a person on those things that will affect them and their concerns. And that's how I try to convince people to participate in the process, because government really has regulation over a lot of these simple and basic things. Even education, if his son was in school, I don't know what happened where you're from in Alaska, but in New York City, the mayor closed the schools. Like, these elected officials have that much control over what happens with us. And so I just generally try to remind people of that.
In Australia, voting is mandatory.
Yes.
How would you feel about that happening here, as opposed to the move in places like where I live in Florida, which is making it harder and harder for people to vote?
I think it's an excellent idea, actually. And it's funny that you mentioned Australia, because I work for a global transportation company, and we do have things that we want to do to try to support and encourage people to vote. And so we do what is called Lime to the Polls, where you can use our scooters to get to a poll site, right, for free. And our social impact manager, she said to me, she went to one person in the government relations office, and they said, we don't have that problem because voting is mandatory. There are places where just voter turnout is very high. So they don't have the issue we have in the United States. I'd be all for it. I love the fact that, you know, automatic voter registration, like you said, things to make it easier to vote than people who put up barriers to vote. But you also got to think, why are people putting up barriers to vote? And maybe I need to elect somebody different, at least try my best to elect them and get through those barriers. But yes, I would be all for it.
Yes, Amy?
As you point out, Nicole, it's so important to have participation in the voting process. I mean, that is what a democracy is based on. And Stacey Abrams has been very successful in getting voters registered in Georgia, you know, and encouraging that effort. It's made a huge difference.
Right.
Does your organization have a way of measuring the success you hopefully have had in getting more people to register and vote than perhaps otherwise?
So actually my focus is less on registration and more on education. And it really goes back to some of the numbers I touched on, and I didn't put them here just because we don't have time to go through all of these kinds of things. But there are so many people already registered and not voting. And so my goal is, let's get the folks who are actually registered to the polls. So now we can register voters in New York City, which, and I'm not saying I don't do it at all, but my focus is on education, because I feel like people are saying, yes, I'm registered, and they're still not showing up. And it's like, well, why aren't those people who can walk into a poll site not going? How can we reach those people? Because if we can keep registering people, and the turnout is still low.
Yes, go ahead.
Oh, this is for Perry, right? My question is kind of, there's a big part of what you were discussing was rhetoric, and also how do we approach people on other sides of the aisle, and how do we come together and things like that, and how we need to like put our differences aside. But my issue with that is, for a lot of people, these policies are, like, politics are personal. It has to be. For a lot of people, this is existential. This is, I could die. This is, my people have been oppressed for how many years? You say you're concerned about, like, the Civil War on the newspaper, but people have been talking about Civil War for the past 60 years. We had a Civil War 160-ish years ago. And that's real as well. How do we come to the other, like, how do you deal with the issue of, like, we need to come together, but there are people who actually have an existential threat to our democracy, to our people, to our way of life.
I think it was Winston Churchill who once said something to the effect of, you know, if you're a society and you have a choice to react to violence with violence to try and preserve your democracy, you'll achieve the violence and you won't achieve the democracy. I think that's the problem. I think unless we all are consistent in our beliefs as to what the rules of the road are for resolving our differences, the end result will be anarchy and civil war and social dissolution. Some people may say, bring it on. That's what I want. Those people, to me, don't love America. I don't know what they love, whether they're Republicans or Democrats. They say they love America, but if you're saying bring it on because I'm a socialist, or bring it on because I don't want people who aren't my color coming into this country, but I love America, I don't know what you love, but you don't love the America that I know. And if those people feel that what I am feeling is such an existential threat, that violence is the only way, I don't really have an answer to that other than that is not the only way. That is the path to destruction of the society that we have as we know it. I said it before and I'll say it again. I believe we must first agree on the rules of debate and the rules of engagement. Because if we don't do that, then the only choice we will have will be dissolution of our society as we know it, and the real possibility of political violence. I don't think there'll be something akin to the Civil War we saw, but I do think there's a distinct possibility we will see more political violence. I know it's a tough thing to hear, but I think you have to say to yourself, my existential threat, and for most people, that existential threat is more figurative than literal. Their life is not necessarily an immediate physical danger, but I think you need to say, I need to be concerned about the existential threat to American democracy, and my particular issue is secondary to that. Because if we have our democracy back on track and functioning, we have proven it in this country. We have the mechanisms to resolve these disputes peacefully, amicably, reasonably.
I wanted to touch on something that he said and correct Perry, not to correct, but as a black woman on the stage, I can't let that question go without recognizing that black bodies and the violence that we are experiencing now, some of us, our physical bodies are on the line. With certain policies and behaviors that are taking place in this country. So I gotta say
no,
that.
I completely,
you know what I mean? Like for us, the physical bodies.
I completely
we have an
acknowledge
issue.
that, and that's also true, you know, for other people as well.
Yeah.
I'm not downplaying that, but what I'm saying is I still believe in the American system of democracy as our best hope of potentially resolving the social problems that we have today. And I think despite the problems we are dealing with, despite the issues we are working on, we have to make those issues secondary to standing up for our democratic system before we can begin to truly resolve those issues in a non-violent fashion. If what you're saying to me is, look, I'm done because I think violence is the only way to resolve it, that is your prerogative, but I don't believe in that. I don't support that.
I agree with you.
Yeah, I guess my thought is never like violence, but it's more even just in the political process. That whole like idea of, oh, we argue and then we wink and have dinner, like how can you be friends? How can you be comrades? How can you have that kind of amicability with people who are willing and loudly willing to put your life on the line for whatever ideology they have?
Of course, and I just chose that as one example, and I don't know the issue they were debating, right? And if they were debating segregation, I would think it would be pretty inappropriate for Ted Kennedy to wink at Bob Dole at the end of that debate, but that wasn't the debate. And you're absolutely right. At a certain point, you don't condone that behavior. But the example I was citing was more generally that most policy debates, they were able to put their differences at the end of the day aside and still become friends and still be friends to move policy forward. But of course, at a certain point, you don't want to condone political behavior. And look, we did that for a very long time in this country. And let's be honest, the Democratic Party was the party of the Southern Democrats. The Democratic Party gave that wink and a nod to the Southern Democrats, who were the bloc in the U.S. Congress on civil rights legislation, not Republicans. It was the Senate Democrats. So your point to that is absolutely well taken. That was an abomination that we allowed that situation to exist. So at a certain point, you're absolutely right. But I still believe in the overall system that we have as our best shot at trying to resolve our differences. In the book that I had mentioned, How Democracies Die, I have to just read to you the last thing. And this is where I think sometimes we're not giving America a fair chance, because he ends by saying this. He says, "Few societies in history have managed to be both multiracial and genuinely democratic. That is our challenge. It is also our opportunity. If we meet it, America will truly be exceptional." We have a very hard task ahead of us. There is no question about it. There are difficult issues that we need to resolve. Whether we will do it remains to be seen, but I think that the system and that the blueprint we have is our best shot at doing it. That being said, I completely agree with you. Certain things are completely outside of the bounds of looking the other way or turning the other cheek. So I apologize if I was too broad in my remarks.
Nicole and Perry, awesome talk. So proud that you guys are a fellow alum here. Thanks for the work that you're doing. I want to take a bit of an energy from Nicole and bring it over to you, Perry. We the people. So Perry, on your whole thesis and the premise about the possibility that our democracy would die, there's an organization called Braver Angels as one example. It's a not-for-profit. Their sole mission is to train us all through workshops how to listen, how to communicate, and how to start the process of finding common ground. And matter of fact, there's going to be 2 Brave Angel workshops with Binghamton students in November. And the goal of that is to not change the institutions, Perry, that you're talking about, which are fundamental, but the people themselves and the way we operate. There is so much going on, I think, in a positive way, where the people are now moving in response to this threat to democracy. People are distrusting the media as they should. They're distrusting their social media as they should. They're talking about racism and homophobia in a critical way, as they should have been doing for many, many years. So here's my question. If the people do start making these changes, not the institutions, to the examples of how democracies have died from those other countries, if you notice, can that make a difference? In other words, institutions are very difficult to change, but people are moving. There is reactions that I see. The kids who are 20, 25, 30 today are talking about things they should be talking about. They are talking about democracy, free speech, and just all the things that you want them to talk about. Do you think that can minimize the chances that our democracy dies?
100%, and it's happened. One example is Chile. Chile, as you know, used to be democracy, then there was a socialist government, then there was a dictatorship, and then there was years of instability where both political sides, similar to the United States, were in a battle, existential threat. Neither side wanted to back down. And they recognized where they were heading as a society, and there was political violence. The society was absolutely coming apart at the seams. And individuals, they were not just elected officials, they were academics and members of the press and politicians, formed some informal groups to begin discussions between these completely opposing political parties who were fighting each other on the streets. And they recognized where they were heading as they were both battling for what they both deemed to be existential threats. The end result will be, we're all dead. They came together. They formed a movement to bring opposing political sides together in Chile for the benefit of Chilean democracy. They eventually grew it to the point where it became the governing party in the country, and Chile restabilized itself as a democracy because of that very fact, because there was a bottom-up movement of people who realized we are not minimizing what has happened in the past. We are not minimizing the importance of the issues we are dealing with. We are not denying there are existential threats out there. But right now, we have guns pointed to each other. And before we can discuss the solution to all those threats, existential or not, we have to put the guns down. Chile came back from the brink. That is a perfect example.
Awesome, thank you.
Take one more question, and then we'll wrap it up.
You say with the whole guns pointed at each other thing, if one side has the gun and the other side decides, okay, we should probably put down the gun, what's to stop the other side from just shooting the side with the gun?
Well, that's obviously a very difficult literal question of who has the guns, and, you know, that is a tough question, you know, and again, I hope we don't find ourselves in a situation where we have to ask ourselves that question, but that raises a whole other issue, which is the madness of the proliferation of guns in our society, and regardless of who's holding them or which side has more than the other, that is a frightening prospect. And you're absolutely right. If some people have all the arms and other people don't, if it ever devolved into civil conflict, what does that mean? I don't have the answer to that other than that it's terrifying. I mean, do you have a suggestion? I mean, do you have a commentary on that?
More of a figurative question than a literal gun
Right.
question. Just like, while two sides are arguing existential threat and so on and so forth, if one side decides what you say and to calm down and to talk about things, and the other side decides they don't want to do that,
You need two participants who are willing to do it. And the only answer I could have to that is if you don't have that, you have a very dark future. And that is a possibility. I'm not denying that could be where we're heading. I hope it doesn't happen.
Well, once again, I would like to thank Nicole and Perry for a great Tier Talk, so a round of applause to them both.
Thank you.
And thank all of you for coming and spending part of your homecoming weekend with us, and we hope you enjoy the rest of the day and the rest of the homecoming weekend. Thank you again.
Thank you.